After all, why shouldn't I do it? Why shouldn't I take another translation question? You guys, I feel like Bilbo with the ring. I just can't let it go. It's so much fun. I've been doing these words episodes on Fridays. I said it was going to be every now and then. I still do intend to do more interviews. I've got some lined up for the year, I promise. But I am just having too much fun talking to you about translation, about how to pick good translations, about what issues go into translation, and more deeply, as a result, talking to you about the nature of language, which is my favorite subject. It is where my heart has always really been at. And so I'm just having a blast. And it seems like you guys like these too. So, I got an email. I mentioned that somebody said I should quit my day job and only do this. I don't really know what my day job is at this point because I'm always just doing stuff that I love, and I feel very lucky about that. But message received. I've been getting a lot of these questions. I have enough of them now to do this for quite some time. So you guys like it, I like it, and most importantly of all, my mom likes these episodes, which you guys know that I would do absolutely anything to make my mom happy. She sends me texts sometimes about particular episodes of the show that she likes, and out of the blue she was like, I really like the words thing. So that settles it. If Mama Clavin says it, it's gonna happen. And I've got a really juicy one today. It's such a juicy one that I think it's going to be a two-parter. I'll just read this question that I got, and then I'll explain why I want to spend some time on answering it. This is from Nathan. And, oh, by the way, to ask me questions, you should go to rejoiceevermore.substack.com. That's my newsletter. It's where you'll get regular updates from me. Plus, if you become a paid subscriber, extra essays and backstage stuff and all sorts of fun things. But either way, you can be in the mailbag and you can ask me translation questions this way. That's what Nathan has done here. Here's his question. What are your thoughts on idiomatic translations versus literal translations? In high school, we read an idiomatic translation of Crime and Punishment. It was uncharacteristically easy to find myself lost in the book, despite each character having 6 names. I know, Russians are the worst about this. The Russian novels, it's impossible. But I mentioned a while back, those names are even themselves bearers of information. They contain more than just this is the guy that we're talking about. That's why you have to keep them even in translation. Anyway, this is not what that question is about. It's about idiomatic translation. It requires a great deal of trust, says Nathan, in the translator's understanding of the culture and times of the original author. Alternatively, I've found literal translations can provide their own interesting insights into foreign cultures with the exposure to their idioms. Okay, this is a big, an enormous question, kind of disguised as a small question that's just about Crime and Punishment. And I would really be interested to know what translation it was you guys were using in school. Maybe, Nathan, you can write to me and let me know. But for this purpose, it's not actually all that important to evaluate that particular translation. It's more important to talk about this larger issue of what I'm going to call register. That is, how formal or informal, how elevated or lowbrow or idiomatic, as you say, kind of casual, slangy, is the translation, and how formal or lowbrow or slangy is the original, and what is the role of register and tone in a translation. And this is actually a question that I get all the time. It raises a million fascinating sub-questions. And the thing that I get asked about most in this context, actually, is a translation of the Bible called The Message. And I'm calling it a translation, but the whole point of these 2 episodes is going to be interrogating and asking whether it really counts as a translation. Because what The Message is, the subtitle is The Bible in Contemporary Language. It's by Eugene H. Peterson, recently passed. He was a pastor and a translator and a scholar in the PCUSA Church, I believe, the Presbyterian Church of the USA, which is the denomination or even the sub-denomination of the church that I am currently a member in. I'm an Anglican by baptism, and that is really where the tradition that I'm closest to and know most about. But I have a wonderful church here in Nashville that is PCUSA, which is what Eugene H. Peterson was part of. The New Testament Message translation came out in 1993. And then in 2002, they put out the whole thing. And I see the Message all over the internet all the time. People make fun of it a lot, as like, I've seen a meme where the KJV, the King James Version, and the NIV and all these other kind of modern translations are like the Avengers that come in, and they all have these different powers and abilities. And then the Message is like the Hulk, this big, lumbering, unsubtle brute that just comes and punches one of them out through the wall. And that's because this translation is the kind of blunt, direct, down-to-earth version of the Bible, although I'm going to complicate that a little bit and get into whether or not it really that's the best descriptor of it. But the question that I get all the time is this accurate? Can I rely on this? Because people kind of like it. Some people like the Message, and you can see why. I mean, I looked into, as I was getting ready to do these episodes, I started reading some of the passages in more detail than I had before. And here's just Genesis 1:1, the famous, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Everybody's heard this passage before. Here's the Message version of it. And so obviously this is from the 2002, the Hebrew Old Testament, as well as the New Testament. Genesis 1:1 in the Message. First this, God created the heavens and earth, all you see, all you don't see. Earth was a soup of nothingness, a bottomless emptiness, an inky blackness. God's spirit brooded like a bird above the watery abyss. God spoke, light, and light appeared. Now, you can see the appeal, right? I definitely can. I mean, it's got immediacy. It's actually also got some poetry to it. It's not purely blunt and casual and slangy. And that's often how it's portrayed, but it's a different and subtler project than that. It's got what an ancient theorist might have called enargeia, which is this wonderful Greek word that means vividness. It's as if like you really can see it right there before your eyes. And I think that's the point of this translation. But it raises the question, and a lot of people ask me this, it's like, why, if this is possible to do, if this is really how the Bible sounds in the original Hebrew and the original Greek, why hasn't anybody done this before? So people get suspicious when translations like your Dostoevsky translation or like The Message are too easy and fun to read. It makes people feel like there's something, I'm getting sold a bill of goods here, like somebody is sweetening this up or making additions and changes. And when you're dealing with the Bible, the Word of God, people get especially antsy about this, and so you'll see at some level you'll see very polemical arguments, high level passionate arguments over the Message and whether it's okay and whether it's allowed. So either you're making fun of it, or you're sort of attracted to it but you don't know what's going on with it, or you're suspicious about it and it sounds sus to you. All of these are possible, but people have a lot of different questions about this. So I wanted to take some time to ask about like what we should think about the Message, and more generally what we should think about translations like the Message that try to make things more accessible, and what are even the categories and tools that we can use for thinking about this particular dimension of translation. So first of all, let's read what the Message says about itself. That is what the publicity team has generated as sort of advertising copy for this work. When I went on their website, I found this. Experience the surprise and wonder of the Message. Poetic, engaging, impactful. So yeah, they're delivering it not as casual so much as direct, and that Greek concept of enargeia here really seems like the right one. They're giving this to you as a translation that's going to make it real and alive and vivid for you. The Message is a reading Bible translated from the original Greek and Hebrew, so they are making the claim for it that it is a translation and not, for example, a paraphrase, which is a word that I've seen elsewhere used about it, which just means kind of like it's not exactly the original, it's somebody telling you what the original means, which would be less, I think, useful, for example, as something to read in church, right? You don't want to paraphrase in church. You want the text itself, and then you want, if there's going to be commentary, you want it to come from outside, not from within the Bible that you're using. So the claim that people make on behalf of the Message is that it's a translation, not a paraphrase, thoroughly reviewed and approved by 20 biblical scholars. So they're obviously aware of the chatter that this is not accurate or faithful. They're trying to mitigate that by saying it's been reviewed and approved by biblical scholars. The message combines the authority of God's word with the cadence and energy of conversational English. Okay, so what I want to do is we want to get to a place where we are able, not just me as somebody that reads Hebrew and Greek, but you as somebody that might not and wants to trust the text that he's using or she is using, right? We want to get to a place where we're able to evaluate claims like this about text, that they really are a translation, that they really are faithful, that we can rely on them, and that we can trust when we go to them that we're getting not just the meaning, but the full force and sense of the original. And that means we have to think about how casual and conversational texts can become without losing fidelity. And this is a good time to break out a couple old kind of sayings about translation, which I'm very proud I haven't yet used in this series, but we should mention them here. One thing people say a lot about translation is that they say traduttore, traditore. Appropriately enough, this is in a foreign language, but this means translation is betrayal. In Italian, which is what the language is, traduttore, which means translator, it sounds very similar to traditore, which is a betrayer. So the translation is betrayal. Another famous one is, insofar as translations are faithful, they are not beautiful. In fact, Yevgeny Yevtushenko, who I believe this quote is often attributed to. It may go back before him, and if anybody knows, I have this weird suspicion in my head that this was originally said in German, about Übersetzung, about translation in German, but maybe I'm wrong. Anyway, translations are like women. Insofar as they are beautiful, they are not faithful. Insofar as they are faithful, they are not beautiful. And now, of course, this is very shocking, and everybody finds this misogynist, but it gets across a point, which is exactly the thing that makes people suspicious about the message. It's too easy to read. It's too glib and clear, and in some places lovely and poetic, and makes us think that we must be sacrificing accuracy. Now, I'm not actually a total dogmatist about this. I don't think it is true that no translation is both beautiful and faithful. I think that those two things are in tension when we translate, and that's what makes translation difficult, because if the original is beautiful, and that's the first thing we have to ask is, do we want our translation to be beautiful? But if we're translating a work that we find has a kind of poetic loveliness, the first thing we have to ask is, what kind of beauty is that beauty? There are all sorts of different kinds of beauty. There's mellifluous elegance, there's hard-nosed, spare austerity, there's a bunch of different ways that a text can be beautiful. And then how do we get that across in the English without losing the meaning? And I don't think that's impossible. I just think it's like in the Bible where it says justice and peace shall kiss. It's like justice is one thing, peace is another thing. These are two separate values, and doing one doesn't necessarily mean doing the other, but the ideal is that we would have a just peace, that there would be peace through justice and justice through peace. That's what we're aiming at. It's never possible to do it perfectly, but I don't actually think it's totally impossible to make it happen. And the way I think to think about it in these terms is to use this concept of register. And register is what we mean when we're talking about how casual or formal a text is, whether it sounds like something that would be a court oration, or whether it sounds like something that you would just kind of chat to your bros about, or what. That's what I use the word register to mean. And it's actually a quite old concept in literary criticism. It's not limited to translation that we would think about register. And you can think about, for example, like if you wanted to translate James Joyce, who is this modernist, you would want him in French or in Italian or whatever language you're translating him into to be kind of disjointed and slangy, and you wouldn't want him to sound like Homer or like Tennyson or whatever. So that's register, right? That's this kind of quality or character of a text. And people have been thinking about this for a very long time. In fact, it's one of the primary categories that we get in the work of Dionysius of Halicarnassus, who's a great source if you're interested in thinking about ancient literary criticism. This guy, 1st century AD, he obviously comes from Halicarnassus, which is also where Herodotus, the famous original historian, the father of history, came from. That's in Turkey, Asia Minor. And then he ended up in Rome after the civil wars under Augustus. So beginning of the empire here, 1st century AD, seems to have worked as a teacher and, taught rhetoric and grammar, but also wrote history. And famous Roman Antiquities is his really kind of magnum opus, or at least the one that comes down to us. But he's also got, to me, a somewhat more interesting text. I'm probably in the minority here in finding this to be Dionysius's most interesting work, but he wrote this book on literary composition. And he also has some commentaries on individual stylists, like he wrote one on Demosthenes, the great orator. And he's often talking about rhetoric, and not just speeches, but how to compose a rhetorically compelling piece of work. And he gets in chapter 21 to talking about this concept of what we would call register. And he actually says that he is the first person to develop kind of a system for naming the different registers. But he lays it out. So let me read to you what he says, because I think this is really helpful and will get us into thinking about even what register is and what we're talking about when we're thinking about things like the Message or an idiomatic translation of the of Dostoevsky. Here's Dionysius chapter 21. I can say without any hesitation that there are many specific differences of composition, and that they cannot be brought into a comprehensive view or within a precise enumeration. I think, too, that as in personal appearance, so also in literary composition, each of us has an individual character. And that word in the Greek, which is going to be Dionysius's primary sort of metaphor for this phenomenon, is charakter, which is where we get our word character. It comes originally from the stamp of a coin or a seal. So if you're a king, you have your face on a coin, you've got some stamp, your charakter, that you impress into the metal. And so that gives it the outline and the shape that sort of conveys your character, your nature. And this is a really prime, core, deeply embedded metaphor in Greek. And it's why, for example, when Jesus says, whose face is on this coin, he's talking there about the character, that Caesar's face has been stamped onto the coin, but God's image has been stamped onto your soul in the same way. And so this is a very deep image, and Dionysius is using it to talk about the way that all writing reflects a kind of character that is as distinctive as the individual doing the writing, like your personality, like your individual face. Your work, your written work, if you're a skillful composer, is going to have a distinctive character, and you can't really nail down a system because each one is unique. They're all special snowflakes. But when we do criticism, we have to generalize and we have to draw connections between overall groups. And so that's what Dionysius is now going to do. He says, I find not a bad illustration in painting. As in that art, all painters from life take the same pigments, but mix them in the most diverse ways. So in poetry and in prose, though we all use the same words, we do not put them together in the same manner. This is this concept of synthesis, which is where we get our word synthesis. And it's a very, very common observation, important point for a lot of Greek theorists, that we take these elements, these stoicheia, they are the letters and the syllables and the words, and then we combine them, and it's in the combination that the language takes on life and character and form. So that's what register is. It's the character of the text, the way that it gets across, not just what's being said, but how it's being said. I hold that the essentially different varieties of composition are the three following only. He's saying this is the overall, even though they're all different, there are sort of three major brands, if you like, of character. And anyone who likes can give them appropriate names when he has heard their characteristics and their differences, but I can't find recognized names for them. So he's saying with some modesty, perhaps false modesty, that nobody else has ever noticed this before and given it a system. So I'm going to give it a system. There are three of them. I call them by metaphorical terms. The first is austere, austera. And the second, smooth or florid, tein glafuran, is what he, kalo tein glafuran. So these are in the accusative. So I'm call them the kalo, austeron, glafuran, and eukraton. So they are the austere, the smooth, and the well mixed, or the harmoniously blended. And he's going to go on to give examples and he talks about this also when he's dealing with Demosthenes and so on. But basically you've got this kind of archaic, austere very spare and even stoic way of getting things across, which is associated in the Roman world with the past and with ancestors and with the kind of simplicity and rustic good sense of the forefathers. If you think about Ernest Hemingway, maybe that's an example of the austere character, although it might not quite be elevated enough. And then the florid is this very sort of decorative, even Asiatic maybe, or Greek-sounding way of talking that is very elaborate. And Cicero it talks a lot about the sort of, or distinction between these kind of more elaborate forms of speech and then the more kind of rough-hewn and straightforward. And then there's a kind of blend of the two where you take each from, you take different phrases from each and you kind of move back and forth between different registers. And so what we're starting to get here is like a spectrum. It's not a binary, it's a spectrum, okay? But when people say it's a spectrum, what they usually mean is like there are no distinctions. Except, of course, real spectrums, like the rainbow, do have distinctions. It's just that they are gradual. You go from red to orange to yellow to green to blue, but there are kind of blendings in between. And that's kind of what this system of Dionysius is like. It's like you can go from low to high in register, but and there's an infinite number of points on the spectrum in between, but you also can identify certain general kind of categories of caractère or character or register. That's the category, that's the axis or the spectrum that we want to be thinking along when we think about register in translation. Because so far, we've actually only been talking about it within an individual language. Dionysius is talking here about Greek composition, and he's saying within Greek, or we might say within English, you can use all these different registers. You can go high, you can go low, you can be austere, you can be smooth, you can do all that. And what we're looking for, always, in every instance, but certainly in terms of literary composition, what we're looking for is to prepon, which is from the Greek verb prepo, and it means that which is appropriate. So we have some idea in our head, and this is going to come back to our core concept that I introduced in the first one of these episodes. We have this idea in our head, and we want to clothe that idea with language that fits it rightly, so that the outlines of the fabric, that is the words, the linguistic fabric, conform to the outlines of the body. And the body is invisible. It's an idea, and maybe we have an idea that is in itself elevated. And that's part of the idea, which is going to be an important thing to remember. This is not just a little decoration. Oh, I have this bare notion like that Achilles killed Hector, and I'm just going to clothe it in whatever form I like. I'm going to make it very elevated, but now I'm going to make it into a comedy or whatever. No, the idea is that part of what's in me, part of the ineffable, invisible spirit of what I have to convey is its character, is its whether it is an elevated thing or not. And so I need to match my register, my character of words, to the fact that actually this is a moment of high drama and intensity. And that's what Homer then does, is he does it up in this kind of very dramatic and noble way. And so this is now we're thinking within our own language, but we also, because we're translating, we have to think about the target language, right? We have to think about the fact that other languages also have these differences in register. So here's what I want you to do. Think about an X and a Y axis, like a graph, the kind that you would do in geometry class in school or in algebra class. And this is graphing poetry on an XY axis is almost comically pedantic, and there's a scene in Dead Poet Society where Robin Williams makes fun of this idea. But actually, that movie is a little bit too dismissive of this, because as Dionysius observes, of course, no system is enough. It's always going to be reductive because language is sort of infinitely variable and alive and powerful. But you do need systems to start with, to kind of organize your thoughts, and then we can complicate it. So bear with me as I graph this onto an XY axis, and there's a horizontal axis and a Y, an up and down vertical axis. And on the horizontal plane, on the horizontal axis, think about words that mean basically the same thing in different languages. I said at the outset there are no true synonyms. There's no totally interchangeable words because they all have their own character. But you can basically locate things roughly on the same horizontal axis if you think about words that mean the same thing in different languages. So the x-axis is going to be the translation axis, and we'll say like, okay, dog, right, is somewhere on the x-axis in English, and then if you move over to the right, you get chien in French, and if you keep moving, you get perro in Spanish, kuon in Greek, canis in Latin, kelev in Hebrew, and you could go in, on into infinity in all the other languages of all these different words that basically just mean dog. Okay, that's your x-axis, your horizontal axis. Now think about the y-axis of the graph, so going up and down within a particular horizontal point. So if we start in the English place and we don't move to the right or left, we just stay within English, and now we move up and down the vertical axis, we'll find that there are a million different registers. And this y-axis, the vertical axis, is going to be the register axis. So take dog, for example, right? Dog is not the only word in English that means dog, that describes the kind of animal that we mean when we describe dog. So dog has a denotative meaning, which is dog, but we could also say hound. And in many contexts, hound just means dog, right? But it means dog in a slightly different way, and we need to think about how that way is different. And in order to think about that, think about the fact that we could also say mutt, right? So now we've got three words all located in a straight line on the y-axis, the register axis: dog, hound, mutt, doggo, pupper, right? So these are all words that are more or less elevated in this register and tone, right? So hound would probably be up top, right? Way high. A hound is a very sort of almost Shakespearean sounding. You might speak of a hell-hound, right? But then dog would be kind of maybe in the middle at the origin point on the axis. And then you go down, you might say to your dog, come here, you mutt, right? Now we're getting more casual, now we're getting a little chiller. And then if you were going to say, like, such a good doggo, like, come here, pupper, let me boop your snoot, like, that's definitely way, way down on the vertical axis, right? And interestingly, just to complicate things even further, here's something that proves Dionysius' point about synthesis, the way that you combine and put words together and how that affects things. Because there's even more register complexity in just the concept of the idea of dog than that one list of words that I just gave you. That's already in English. We've got a lot of different ways to say dog. You could come up with more, right? And they all have a slightly different register. They all have a slightly different kind of feel to them or degree of formality. But now think about, okay, hound on its own sounds kind of hoity-toity and elevated, right? You might say, if you say hound, you're really thinking in terms of like, I picture, a 14th or 15th century print or picture of a hunt, in the king's court. That's the hounds, release the hounds. But then if you say hound dog, you put it together with the casual word, that kind of sounds sleazy and lowbrow, right? You ain't nothing but a hound dog. And even dog alone in certain contexts can be sort of more magisterial. So here's Shakespeare, Julius Caesar, scene 3, act 1, or act 3, scene 1. Cry havoc and let slip the dogs of war. So the place that the word comes in the sentence, the other words that are next to it, the way it gets combined, all this affects register. And at the same time, you have all these different words on the y-axis that make the register different. So there's your vertical axis. Now you have to think, if you go over on the horizontal x-axis and you translate into another language, every language also has the vertical axis. So it turns out that in French, chien is not the only word for dog, just like dog is not the only word for dog. In English, they have a bunch of other ones. So here are some. There's clébard, which can be shortened to kleb, and that's kind of a casual, maybe closer to like a puppy or something. But then there's another word for really diminutive little puppy, and that's chiot. There's un cabot, which is like kind of a friendly pup, like the golden retriever boyfriend type, There's un molus, which is the hulking grim. And in the French edition of Harry Potter, Hagrid's big dog Fang, that's a molus, right? And so, we might think of some sort of like a hound in that context. Then there's un tutu, which is just probably closer to pupper, right? It's like, oh, you little tutu. And so this is the sort of thing that a translator has to keep in mind. Ideally, what you want to be doing is you want to travel straight on the horizontal axis from your original language to your target language without slipping too much on the vertical axis, down or up in register. So if the French translators of Harry Potter had described Hagrid's dog as a tutu, then they would have been making an actual error in translation, even though technically the denotative meaning of their words is still there, is still right. They're still saying dog, but it's not a tutu, it's a molus, right? It's a hound, it's not a puppy, it's not a pupper. But if they had put tutu or chiot or club into Hagrid's mouth, that would have been a good translation, right? Because Hagrid thinks that Fang is a little puppy because he's a big hulking giant and he loves monstrous animals. And so he would maybe talk to his molus as if it were a chiot or a tutu. And that's the kind of thing that translators are having to think about. You want to move on the x-axis without slipping on the y-axis. You want to move from language to language without slipping in register. But even that is oversimplifying because it's not actually just one vertical axis where you can go from more formal to less formal. Remember, the Dionysius says, I'm gonna say that, I'm gonna define these different categories of character, but really there are as many different kinds of character as there are people. And you can see this in English. It's not just an XY axis, it's 4D chess. It's like a 12-dimensional Ouroboros. There's a million different kinds of register in English, and English is especially rich in this way, but as we've just seen with French, it's not limited to English that this is true. There are forms of slang that you can incorporate that come from specific regions that would only be appropriate in those regions. I mean, an example of this would be Cockney rhyming slang. So some of you might know that the Cockney accent in English comes with this distinctive and idiomatic form of slang where you use something that rhymes with the idea rather than the idea itself. So instead of saying dead, you might say brown bread because brown bread rhymes with dead. Or if you were going to say steps and stairs, like conveying the idea that something comes in degrees, you would say apples and pears rather than steps and stairs. And you can go on The Guardian. They have this great website, this great piece, The Guide to Cockney Rhyming Slang, where you can look up others. But in French, there's something sort of vaguely analogous where you turn words backwards. So in French, you say meuf, and that means femme, which means woman. So if you want to say woman, but in a kind of slangy way, you say meuf. And that sounds like you're like a street tough. You know, it's kind of like early 2000s rap slang. If you listen to Jams, for example, who was a big French rapper, she says meuf and all those other, you know, like sort of French street slangy words. And so if you used those words, you would be getting across something about the meaning of the text. You would be suggesting that the characters, you'd be conveying information about the relationship of the characters, about how Hagrid feels toward his dog, about where these English-speaking Cockneys come from, right? All of this becomes a part of the translation. It's a matter of connotation rather than denotation. Remember, we talked about words denote things, that is, they mean a certain thing or a certain idea, they convey a certain idea, but they also connote certain associations and they bring up certain thoughts and feelings. And that is why something like the Message needs our careful scrutiny, or an idiomatic translation of Dostoevsky. It's not because idioms are never appropriate in translation, it's because they're intimately part of translation. And the register that we use is part of the essence of what we get across. So you wouldn't want to translate an elevated text into street slang, and you wouldn't want to translate a street slang text into high dramatic prose, except as a joke, right? Unless you were kidding around. And so because part of what is being said is these are the relationships that these characters have. This is how they regard the world around them, because language is more than just a spreadsheet for linking sounds to ideas. It's a vehicle for the inward experience of life. And the reason that we have all these different registers and slangs and regional dialects and everything is because each person is having a distinctive experience of life in relation to the world and to everybody else, and we need all of these different words to get all of that across. And that's something that you have to think about when you're writing in English. Every day when I write, I think about what's the appropriate word to use here out of all the different options of words that mean basically this thing that I have in mind, and what's the right sound, what's the right register, what's the right tone. When you translate into a new tone, you are making a statement about how you think the original was received. And in fact, that is going to be the point of the message. And that's something that Peterson himself said about his translation. He said, this is the guy that made the message. He says, when Paul of Tarsus wrote a letter, the people who received it understood it instantly. When the prophet Isaiah preached a sermon, I can't imagine that people went to the library to figure it out. That was the basic premise under which I worked. I began with the New Testament in the Greek, a rough and jagged language, not so grammatically clean, which is something people have emphasized recently. There's some new translations of the New Testament, Sarah Rudin, David Bentley Hart, who that kind of get this across. This is kind of a slangy street Greek, the Koine Greek. I just typed out a page the way I thought it would have sounded to the Galatians. And my answer to this is kind of going to be yes and no. It is true that Koine develops out of and past the sort of more classical Attic Greek and contains more casual registers and contains ways of conveying just kind of more straightforward and easygoing modes of speech. But it's not the case that every piece of the Bible is written in that way. And it's not even necessarily true that nobody ever had to go to the dictionary to figure out, or to the ancient equivalent of a dictionary, to figure out how to understand a text. There are actually very highfalutin passages of the Bible, even within their cultural context. And so what I'm going to do next week is I'm going to look not just at the message, but at a few other texts and translations of the Bible and of other different sources that can get us into looking at to what extent is it appropriate and is it an accurate translation to go into kind of a lowbrow or street register with the Bible. Okay, you guys are going to have to stage an intervention. I am having too much fun. Please do rate, review, share, subscribe, mention to your friends, tell your cat. It always helps to grow the show. I have this Substack that I mentioned, rejoiceevermore.substack.com. I also have a joint Substack with my dad, Andrew Clavin, no relation, at thenewjerusalem.substack.com. Both I highly recommend to you, as well as my book, How to Save the West, Ancient Wisdom for 5 Modern Crises. Next week, we're going to keep going with this and talk more about register and the message. See you there.